The premise of our reading today couldn't be simpler. Reincarnation, there it is. He didn't really give us much embellishment. It's just the fact of that, and now we have to deal with it, as they say. I was very, just that slang phrase reminded me of a little documentary I saw about doctors talking about Daniel Brinkley called it greed for life, that causes people to be unable to accept that at a certain point your incarnation is over. And many people, and these are facts that people don't talk about, that an enormous amount of the crisis of medical care is because the number I heard was 70% of all the money is spent in the last 6 months of life trying to keep people alive, as Daniel Brinkley put it, for an extra 21 days, which he also reminded us would be the most unpleasant 3 weeks of our lives. But having said all of that, there were these doctors, I saw a documentary about doctors trying to change the conversation. And he says, sometimes you just want to look at your patient and say, "You're mortal, get over it." Just like that. So I feel a little bit with his reading that Swami gave us, you've lived before, accept it, And I think in this room, there's at least a wide openness to the possibility, if there's not a certainty. Swamiji was amused by someone who came to tell him once, you may choose to reincarnate, but I think I prefer not to. Fine, it either is or it isn't. The main question we really have to ask is, how does it apply? How does it help us? How does it make it useful? As Swamiji points out, even when Krishna is speaking to Arjuna, this is not an abstract teaching. This is just something that Krishna says is there. And in fact, Jesus said in many places in the Bible that this is the truth of it. And it also was clear from the context of those comments that his disciples were entirely with him. They didn't dispute it. For example, when he said to his disciples, "Who am I?" then they listed out prophets who had lived and died in the past. And there was just a conversation. It wasn't a question of whether or not he could have been. It was only a question of which one. And then when Jesus answered them that John the Baptist was a reincarnation of the great prophet, and he said, he's returned, but they knew him not. And all the disciples knew he was talking about John the Baptist. When Christ was going to heal a man who was blind, who'd been blind from birth, his disciples said to him, "Is it his sins that caused him to be born blind, or was it the sins of his parents?" Sins is the Bible's word for karma, ignorance, unlearned lessons, whatever you're carrying that isn't full of light. And Jesus did not correct them. He did not say, "Oh, no, it's not possibly, it couldn't be true." It was just part of the conversation. And there is well-documented evidence that a few hundred years after Jesus died, there was a council of church elders, and they decided that reincarnation was not a convenient teaching for the church, because if people thought they had all that time, they wouldn't, first of all, try as hard, was the point, but even more to the point, church would have less control over them. Because if you've been born before and you're going to be born again, what happens right now and who's dictating this little space, it has a whole different picture. So most of the references to reincarnation were simply taken out of the Bible. But a few snuck in that weren't recognized, or for some reason they didn't think they could. Now, why does this matter? You see, it matters enormously, because once we have to figure out how to make our spiritual life work, from the time we appear in a baby's body to the time we take our last breath, that means that the only reality is right here. And the poor church, God bless them, because in the role that I've lived in with Ananda, and it may sound presumptuous to some of you, but I don't think so, Yogananda's impact on the world will in time prove to be of the nature of Jesus and Buddha and Krishna and all the other great avatars who come with a powerful mission to redirect society and take it in a new way. So I'm at the beginning of something that will last far longer than ourselves. And in this position, a lot of times we have to make decisions not just based on what we personally prefer, but because everything that we do begins to define the way things are done. And I myself have made some mistakes that 25 years later, I see that they have become dogma. At one point, randomly, out of just sheer callow youth, I took Master's healing prayer and I changed it. Master's prayer said, Divine Mother, manifest your healing presence. And I just thought more words would be nicer. So I started saying, Divine Mother, manifest your energy, light, and joy. That sounds nice, doesn't it? Yeah, it sounded nice to me too. So every time we did the healing prayer, I would just say that. And being a rather enthusiastic person, people started saying it all around me. And then 25 years later, that had become the way, all through Ananda, people said that healing prayer. Then I'm reading Master's teaching on healing, and he says, where Divine Mother is present, there no illness can exist. And all of a sudden I hear, manifest your healing presence in a completely different way that I had just utterly missed the first time around. Very subtle teaching, completely different than manifest your energy, light, and joy. There's nothing wrong with energy, light, and joy, but all the subtlety is lost in it. So I had to write a global letter of apology. Fortunately, my memory is keen, so I was able to tell people, guess what? This is the gospel according to Asha, and I really don't think that's the gospel we want to follow. And let's go back. And, most people had no idea. So just having lived, I used to joke, we used to wear these, a lot of us would wear these earplugs, these little they had little baffles on them, they were plastic like this, and they were on a little string, because it helped when you're meditating in noisy places. So you'd stick these things around in your ears, and then when you weren't meditating, the little string would hang down. And so a lot of times you would see people walking around with these little baffle-shaped, little curly-Q, little plastic things hanging on this little string. And I had this picture that people would have photographs of the early Kriyabans, and they would all be wearing this little string with this little thing, and gradually you would make them out of brass, and then you make them out of gold, and then you'd put on the little baffles, and they'd just hang there, and nobody would have the slightest idea, where these come from, but there in the photograph you see the early Kriyabans are wearing them. So we want to do all this exactly the same. There's been an even funnier one just since I'm chatting about this. We'll get to reincarnation in a minute. Swami Kriyananda was always in the habit of signing his name with a lowercase s. And when he wrote Kriyananda, he would with a small k, and then sometimes he'd sign it KR. It would always be lowercase letters. Well, a handwriting analyst told him that people who make their signature with lowercase letters are actually suppressed egotists who in fact have an arrogant sense of themselves, and they do the lowercase in order to pretend humility. And she was panic-stricken that Swami Kriyananda was revealing himself and pleaded with him to put a capital S. Whether or not her interpretation was true, I don't think it applied to Swami. And he did not take it seriously. I said, sir, why do you use a small s? He said, because it saves one keystroke. He said, when you type as much as I do, every keystroke counts. Okay, now, I type a lot too, and my name has two A's at either end. And I like the symmetry of two small A's. So I started typing my name, Asha, with small letters. Then I start seeing it pop up all over the global Ananda, because there, Swami Kriyananda, he always used a lowercase letter, didn't he? And recently I had to send out the same global letter. He was doing it to save a keystroke, because now even on official documents I see people signing with lowercase letters. Okay, go ahead if you want to, but oh God. And these are just tiny little things. So the church council gets together and they have an idea. And their idea is we need to get people to pay attention to what we're saying. And now the problem is, you see, if you only have one incarnation, that means that the whole story ends when you die. So, are you saved or do you go to hell? Now, what Jesus actually taught is that God is our loving Father, and that as ye sow, so shall ye reap. He who lives by the sword will die by the sword. But gosh, lots of people who live by the sword die comfortably in old age in their bed, surrounded by their loving relatives. So we have sort of a problem here, but that's no problem. We'll just declare something else. So all of a sudden we have this situation where you're either saved or you're damned. Because we've taken the common sense out of the situation. And so how can we tell whether you're saved or you're damned? Well, the church then has to give you all these rules. And you just end up way out there in a place that you never really expected to be. And so if you're not baptized, you're not going to be saved. Well, what about all the people who never heard about Jesus Christ? Well, I guess we better rush out and tell them about Jesus Christ, because otherwise they're going to be damned. And then what about little babies? Because they never had a chance to make a decision, so they get caught in limbo. Limbo. I think limbo was recently dissolved. And someone said, what happened to all the little babies that were in limbo? Nirmoha said, oh, they gave them to the Hindus so they could be reincarnated. I'm not trying to be rude, but really. Because you have to have more than this one lifetime, or none of it means anything. And to a very real extent, that's a lot of why people are losing heart for a lot of these institutional religions. Because it doesn't resonate, with our intimate relationship with God and the hope we have in our hearts about what's going to be possible, and the compassion that we know that we need, because it takes us a long time to learn things, doesn't it? Even one little tiny habit, if you manage to shift it in one lifetime. I mean, many people face, for example, drug addiction or alcohol addiction, and it's a big fight. And if you manage to succeed from one of those serious delusions and pull yourself together in this incarnation, I mean, everything else can just go by the wayside if you manage to cover that one. But that's hardly everything. And so when we die, that's it. But when we think of this as an ongoing story, when we begin to understand that we are, as Swamiji says, as old as God. And Swami writes, it's interesting, it's in Conversations with Master, I was just reading it, that somebody told Swamiji when he was a young disciple with Master, somebody just said, sometimes the souls are just lost. They're just, if they don't make enough progress, God just casts them aside. And Swamiji said, even though it may seem odd, he said that was deeply disturbing to him. He had this great fear that in the end he wouldn't be good enough. And it was his own self-doubt, the karma that he carried. And finally, after about a year, he told Master what he'd heard and asked him if it was true. And Master emphatically said, every soul is a part of God. There is no way that a soul can be destroyed or lost. It's already a part of the infinite. And Swamiji writes, he said, I know it may sound incomprehensible to others, but this was an enormous comfort to me. Now, really think about that in our hearts, to really know that this story will go on until we have mastered everything that we have to master. And we will continue in our lives until that perfect freedom and that perfect joy is realized. I mean, when I first heard about reincarnation, I was in my late teens. I grew up in America. I'd never thought about it one way or another. But it was a very interesting theory to me. I didn't reject it, but as soon as I started trying to understand what I saw going on around me, in terms of this being the middle and not the end of the story, which is really simply how I thought about it in my mind. When you come into the middle of any story, you don't necessarily know how these characters got into this particular conundrum. And if you don't see the end of the story, then you don't actually know how they really got out of it. if you think that that's all the story there is, then there's enormous mysteries on both sides. And if somebody tells you that's the way God wants it, you're going to begin to think that this God fellow is really either not very nice or not very smart. Like, what a mess. You know, that some people are born privileged, some are talented, some are crippled. You know, some people get away with it and die surrounded by their families, and some poor innocent is just persecuted. It's really, I mean, becoming an atheist is a really solid response to that. Almost every atheist or agnostic, at least, and certainly every atheist I've met, generally speaking, has really good reasons for it, which is given that concept of the divine, given that concept of cosmic reality, I wouldn't buy it either. But our hearts, you see, are not contented with that, because we have these longings inside of us that really won't be silenced no matter how hard we try. I had the unfortunate experience once of being on a panel for the Atheist Society of Santa Clara Valley or something like that. The reason I accepted the invitation, all I can say is it seemed like a good idea at the time. It was one of the weirdest evenings I have ever spent. And I was on this panel, and there was an Episcopal or some kind of a basic Protestant priest, and there was an evangelical person and myself, and I don't know if there was any other people representing churches. I don't know why and then there were all the atheists. And the evangelical, the Protestant guy was trying to build bridges. I looked at him and felt like he was selling his soul to the devil, was really the only opinion I had of him. The evangelical guy and I, who normally would not have been at all in tune with each other, were like huddled together. Literally, we kept pushing our chairs closer to each other. And, we were whispering. I felt like we were the only two in the room who could feel what was happening. And there's only one word that I can use to describe it. I felt like I was in the presence of evil. And I've been in the presence of evil, and I know what it looks like. And the real powerful spokespeople for the atheist position, one of them was actually a caricature of himself. I always sort of admire people who are so committed that they actually become caricatures of themselves. At least they have energy. Not only was he totally dressed in black and kind of slightly Ichabod Crane-ish, but he had actually grown his hair long and dyed it a darker shade of black so that he could just be the personification of darkness. And ego is actually something you can feel in your hands. I mean, he had so much ego. He was just walking around being whatever you are, the king of the atheist society. And it just was, there was no joy in his eyes. Let's put it that way. Just none. Absolutely none. I thought, what do you do when you're alone? When you're not strutting around this room? Who are you? And I didn't like him much. But most of all, I felt so sorry for him. And do you know what I thought in that moment? Thank God for reincarnation. Because if this was the end of the story, this poor sap, where would he end up? Because all he was doing was walking around destroying. That was his job. He was just destroying. He was trying to find as many ways as he could to take away hope, faith, and it was all in the name of reality. But what reality? No reality that the heart responds to. No reality that anybody who has any sensitivity to the finer things would ever want to have. So when I first heard, we're in the middle of a story. And there was this enormous, over time, what I did is I tried the theory on like a scientist in a lab. And every time I found something inexplicable, I tried to explain it, make sense out of it as the middle of the story. Well, if I had seen somebody come to this situation through a series of events, you hear about a lot of really bad behavior in the world or misunderstandings, and what would be the consequences of that? I've become a marvelous storyteller of apocryphal reincarnation explanations of things, because every time I find a situation I don't understand, I met a friend who finds himself with a severely disabled child, and that reality has completely defined and confined his life. And he's accepted it with nobility, but most people have children, and that raising of children is a process, and in the end, the children are adults and they go on in their lives. And if the parent is fortunate and those children are actually in harmony, then you even remain friends. And if your children are noble, then they become a support for you in your life. I mean, that's the scenario. But if your child is not mentally capable or physically capable, you are a parent forever, aren't you? And there's never the time when now we can travel. It's every single day from the birth of that child to the end, right? Now, why would that happen? I mean, quite apart from the child, why would that happen? Oh, let's see. I have a wife who has 4 children, but she's gotten kind of old. She's not really as attractive as she used to be, and those kids are spoiled rotten, and it's just a drag to go home. And my secretary is really attractive. Bingo, you're gone. Then you never look back. Do you think that nobody notices? That the cosmos doesn't notice? Do you think that we can just do whatever we want to do, indulge our most selfish considerations, and then nothing ever happens if we can get away with it? Of course not. And then you see, then spiritual life begins to make sense. Everything begins to make sense. I'm having an experience here, and there's things I need to learn. I was accused once of some fairly ignoble behavior, and I was absolutely innocent. I was, you gotta believe me. I was completely innocent. In fact, I really was. I hadn't done it at all, 0, nothing. But for some reason, people seemed to think I had. And then one day when I was being really honest, I said, but I could have. It's not that I would have, but I could have. It's like it was in me. I could feel it. It was in me. And I thought, okay, I probably got away with it the last time. And so this time it's catching up with me. But you see what that does, and let me finish with this simple thought. The more I understand reincarnation and accept it to the marrow of my bones, the more relaxed I've become about everything. And relaxed in 2 ways. One is, well, honey, you might as well just buckle down and do it. Because it's do it now or do it later. And when later comes, it will be now. We imagine that later is actually later, but later isn't later, later is now. And now it's not pleasant, and now then it won't be pleasant either. So either now or now. And often I've had to say, this has been enough of a trial in this one incarnation. I really do not want to spend another one that looks like this, or at least that has it in it. That's the one side of it. So you just don't quit. And you really don't quit. On the other side of it is, this is way too much for me. I just really can't handle this. Master says, if you know that a trial that's coming to you, that you're facing, a test that you have to face, is bigger than you can, that you can't be victorious, and you know defeat is inevitable, he said, if at all possible, run away. Isn't that interesting advice? He said, because you don't want to get the experience of constantly being defeated. Because then you begin to think of yourself as someone who can't triumph. And running away is relative. But what he meant by that was, you have to sometimes just humbly accept, I really can't deal with this. This person in my life is much more negative than my capacity to remain calm in the face of it. I think I just won't see them anymore. This person that I really am trying to convert to these ways of thinking, he's just making me doubt my own conviction. I think I need to give up and not do this anymore. I mean, sometimes we have no choice, but often we really do have a choice. And then reincarnation gives you the comfortable realization that I'll have to face it later. If I can't do it now, I'll be stronger later. Swamiji, once I had a difficult karma, and it suddenly left my life. And I said, Swami, it's like I don't have to face it. And he said, well, maybe that karma is over. And I was just going, yippee, like this. But I don't think so. He finished the sentence. He said, but it's too much for now. He said, just go and live your life here, and you'll come back to it. Either later in this life to when you're stronger, or in another life. I laughed. Swamiji fired me from a job once. I was running the publications company really, really badly. And it was a very complicated situation. And so on Friday, he fired me. He just told me that it just wasn't going to work. He switched my job with Shivani. We switched jobs. And I looked at him and I said, sir, I know there is a lot that I have to learn, and I really want to learn it, and I want to hear your reasons, but why don't you give me the weekend off? And so for the weekend, I can just enjoy that I don't have to do this anymore, and on Monday we can talk about what I was supposed to learn. He said, okay. So I was really happy all weekend, and then on Monday, and I had to deal with all my shortcomings. I think every once in a while we get a whole incarnation like that. We just say to our guardian angel, I've had it. I'm just going to live in Hawaii. Before the missionaries came, just Hawaii, and we'll just dance the hula, and we'll eat coconuts off the trees, and we'll live in grass huts, and next incarnation I'll go back to work. And that's fair. It's our reality. And sooner or later we'll get it straight. And how much we want to strive, and how much we want to suffer, and how long we want to wait, God gives us the free will to decide. Choose wisely. God bless.